Enable live audio. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's lunchtime lecture. It's the first one back after our summer break. My name is Carrie, and I'm a content writer and producer at the ODI. I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Jen Persson, who's the founder of defenddigitalme, which has been advocating for the rights of the 23 million people in the National Pupil Database since 2015. Jen campaigns for safe, fair and transparent data in education in England and beyond. Today's lecture will be on why common metaphors for data don't work, what it means for the success or failure of delivering a sustainable data policy, and what needs to change. Now, before I pass over to Jen, can I please remind you all to keep your microphones and cameras off during the presentation, and that this talk will be recorded. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions at the end. If you do have a question, please put them in the chat. And then at the end, I'll either call you out to ask Jen, or if you'd rather I read out your question on your behalf, please just let me know that as well. So without further ado, over to you, Jen.
Thank you very much. So delighted to be here. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. So data is not an avocado. It was a slightly provocative title, and of course triggered by the outcry after the Australian property developer in 2014 talked about why young people could not afford housing was because they were buying too much mashed avocado and expensive coffees. But often we hear other people and adults talk about young people and have opinions about them, but we don't often hear young people's opinions themselves. So we were really keen at defenddigitalme to have a conversation that involved young people about data, and with the National Data Strategy, and now, of course, the most recent launch of the National Data Consultation, Data New Direction, it's a really timely conversation to have. So we wanted basically to start thinking about the language that politicians use about data and why it matters. So today we're launching our new report. The words we use in data policy, putting people back in the picture. And why is this important to us? We started today to think about the images that people tend to have in their minds when they speak about data. And it was triggered by a debate that both Chianwara, as Shadow Minister for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, and then Minister for Data, John Whittingdale, had in Parliament in November 2020. And they struggled to talk about data in terms that joined up the various metaphors they were using. And what do we mean by metaphors? The pictures that we use to represent something else. So we started to think, what are the most common metaphors we hear about data and we're all familiar with? But before I start on that, I have to say a big thank you to the people that helped us produce this. The youth group, the Warren Youth Project and Hull, have been absolutely fundamental to producing this with their voices, testing our theories that we started out with in January this year, and also to Hatusia, Alice Thwaite in particular, and the researcher Julia Slupska, and also to the producing team that Hatusia brought on board. So I have to say huge thanks, and many others who are listed in the foreword of the report launched today. But our starting point, as I said, was the influence of metaphorical language. And why does it matter? Because we felt really strongly that when MPs were talking about data, they were talking about it in terms of products, in terms of commodities, and in terms of consumer language. And we realized that this took people out of the picture completely. If you do a search, data is oil, you get all sorts of images. You don't get the images that are as harmful. You certainly don't get images of child labor used in oil. And if you're interested in that, that's Human Rights Watch evidence there in Syria's oil industry and child labor. If you search for data is gold, another commonly used metaphor by MPs, you get lots of pictures of gold as a finished end product. Again, you don't get much discussion of how it comes to be that end product. Where does it come from? And what is its labor workforce? How is it produced? So our report, in summary, looked at the common metaphors that we're all familiar with in data language. And we addressed three most common groupings. We found, together with Julia Slupston's research and desktop research as well, the three most common groupings used by MPs since 2010 in Parliament have been around liquids and fluids. So the idea that the characteristics of data is data flows, and also that it becomes things like data lakes. The most commonly used metaphor is a resource or fuel. So data can be mined, data is raw, data is the new oil. It's fuel for the economy. And we did find some uses of data metaphors that looked at the body and residue, the type of images that were left in your mind when these were used was data. It leaves a trace, like footprints, a digital footprint. The questions that came out from the workshop then we tested around these metaphors were, do we think this is a good representation of personal data? And it's an important distinction. We focus in this report around personal data, data about you, about your family, about your lives, and how we felt these metaphors didn't represent that well in discussion. So all of these metaphors, again, sort of started to talk then about the verbs as well that were used, data harvesting, data mining. And again, young people felt this didn't necessarily represent their impression of how they felt data about them was used. The three themes that came out most strongly from our workshop in Hull was a feeling of misrepresentation. Not only could what the data say about you not tell a complete picture, it would only be a partial story of something that happened or an intervention or an interaction with a public body, but it might also misrepresent the full picture. And as data built up over time, you might have a profile, for example, with police, but again, that was only one aspect of your life. The young people drew out concerns around power hierarchies and abuse of power. So because these data can be misleading, they can present not only part of the picture, but actually a picture which is then filled in by others. So the whole story of your life or what happened isn't told. And then we also found they thought very much about how data is used for good, for benefit, to help them in their daily lives and in their interactions, whether it was in education or in other aspects of their life. And data used in your best interests was a theme that was drawn out. But again, they started to question and analyze not only the best parts of that, but also their concerns. So what did it mean when other people were deciding things about you? And very strongly came out in these young people between 14 and 22 was, what does it mean when somebody else acts on that data? And does it therefore remove your own agency and your own autonomy? So at the moment, we look at the landscape in data with these types of mining, extractive, productive, industrial landscapes. And we looked at these different types of metaphors fitting into what could be a vision of today's data landscape that produces data mountains, big data mountains, data lakes, and is the fuel for the economy. But it's polluting, it's toxic, it has side effects, including because of the excessive feeling of mining that there is resistance and boycotts and pushback. Young people talked about alternatives. How could their vision of data be still about being fuel, being part of society, part of an economy, but also being a sustainable source of information, which then became considered fuel or power or a source of innovation, but using more sustainable methods of imagery and thinking about less damaging uses of energy for the environment, and very much talking about how data wasn't then in an extractive, exploitative, one-way system, but was actually part of a community, part of a feeling that it reflected more about who you were and how you fitted into society, and that these stories of your lives could be used in your own best interest, but also in part of the wider picture, with overarching principles were always about human rights, dignity, agency, respect, autonomy. So at defenddigitalme, we came away after the workshop both delighted and really quite impressed with everybody's excellent thinking, really deep thoughts, and fantastic work, and their generosity and their time, but also with these sort of two halves of a landscape, and thinking about how do we then move forwards into the sort of future of the data landscape when these metaphors produce responses and behaviors. One aspect of data collection that is less talked about today than we understand through these simplistic metaphors is that data is telling a story of your lives. This was something that young people really felt quite strongly about, talking about how these sort of third remote product metaphors didn't reflect any aspect of their life. And they talked about how data was information really was something that they were doing. And behavioral activity, behavioral data produced from activity is considered labor, for example, in the research work by Neil Selwyn in Monash University in Australia. And if we think further about the research work by Ben Williamson in Edinburgh and Deborah Lupton, who considered the concept of the datafied child, so how much data is produced about children around them, creating a child that is in data, we then start to think about what happens to that datafied child in this kind of landscape, and what does it look like in a future where we're building artificial intelligence. So we've got a human child whose information is being mined, extracted, turned into machine readable information in order to create artificial intelligence. And in some ways, we're starting to think next about how it is that, what does it leave, where does it leave children? If companies are creating our children in the image of AI so that companies can create AI in the image of man, in effect, trying to recreate human intelligence from existing human intelligence. And what will that mean for children's future who are going to grow up in this environment? It's a simple question. Is child labor ethical? If you look at the kinds of extractive environments that we think about when we use data metaphors, we could also start to think about how are we considering digital labor in the production of children's data. The International Working Group on Data Protection in Telecommunications on e-learning in 2017 pointed this out, how sensitive children's data is. And this is particularly close to my heart because, of course, we work in the education sector. So we'd gone to the young people in Hull, we talked to them about the metaphors, we tested them out. We then went back and looked at Hansard. We looked at, well, what did politicians say? And this is clearer to read in our report, which I'm delighted to launch today and online. But you'll pull out all of these metaphors that various members of Parliament or representatives in the House of Lords have said, that data is fuel for the new economy, that we owe it to the country and particularly our children to get this right and to get our laws fit for the digital age. But still, over and over again, these are the same sorts of metaphors talked about, and very, very rarely does the human feature in this picture. So we're asking, how can we rehumanize and reshape this political narrative on children and young people's data and its use, making new laws? And it matters right now. It matters that MPs and policymakers can have accurate, nuanced, productive discussion. And what we are finding at the moment is that these metaphors limit discussion. MPs trip over the difficulties in language and find that metaphors run out. they can't go anywhere. They haven't got any productive next steps to be able to move forward that metaphor of data is oil in a conversation, because oil cannot build a bridge, for example, as both metaphors were used in the recent announcement of the Data a New Direction consultation in the press recently. It's worth thinking not only why do metaphors matter now, but who's looked at this before in history. And it was interesting when we did some of our research to actually look at some of the artists who we might consider look at information, look at the world through a different lens. What is it that information was telling them in 1929 when Magritte looked at the treachery of images? He used the images of the surrealism to sort of question what is real. What are we looking at? Is this the real picture that we're given by our own impressions, through other people's impressions? And where does that kind of leave our perception on the world and our place in it? And this is one of the questions we're getting to when we say, now, if we are looking at our place in the world, we have to look at not only our place as individuals, but as society and as economy in the world. Data governance models are, of course, under debate right now, having the launch of the DCMS Data a New Direction just last week. The question is, are we going to be trying to create something new? Are we going to try and fit this new revised regime into other people's designs? Are we scrapping something and rebuilding it, or are we building a third way? The direction of travel is we might be building many ways if we are setting up lots of different agreements with lots of different countries around the world. And the question I think we all have to carefully consider is how and what are the real costs of that, when many of these third, fourth, perhaps other ways where we're setting up multiple different agreements with different adequacy agreements might be having to build multiple ways and duplicate what we already have. There's also contradictions in current policy. There's contradictions in government research interest areas. And one of the things that we have drawn out is the sort of negative picture that is drawn of children in current data policy. If we look back at the history of data policy, it's not much better. But looking back as far as Terry Doughty in 2008, who did a lot of great work around children's rights and data as far back as 2002, warning that the National Pupil Database was going to be risky when they started collecting names. Later in 2008, really pointed out the sort of contradiction about data and children and how the stories we're telling about their lives are so negative, when the future of data strategies, the future of data policy is always painted in such positive lights. And I think we really have to say, what are we doing in terms of strategy, in terms of not only communications, but actual real impacts from policies that look at children and how they will be involved in them. So which landscape effectively is the UK going to choose? Will we continue on the same sort of path as we have right now, with this sort of product-based, ownership-driven, sort of extractive model, which will meet more resistance? We've seen that in the most recent GP data grab attempts over the last year, and also in the 2016 to 2018 school boycott of the collection of nationality and country of birth, which led to its end? Or will we look at more involvement in more sustainable methods of data use, which aren't about mining data and passing it over to others, but are actually about data access, not distribution, and looking at involving the human and the person in this story? So if we look at questions that come up in, for example, the National Data Strategy, they look at things like skills and the status quo, and they talk about scale. We also have to look at this in context of children's lives in other things. How is this affecting, for example, their education, and thinking about education? Where does this fit in the big picture, literally? And particularly right now with all the efforts around AI and investment in teaching people, and sort of the suggestions in various other policies, including the CDEI and others institutes. How are we going to teach children about data, about AI, and also questions around whether and how that is sustainable? What does it mean if we start teaching about one thing at the expense of another, and at what costs? The strategy framing that we have right now says we want to produce forward-looking strategy that looks at public opinion and delivers real change. Well, we need to make sure that we are really considering whether that, I think, is a genuine offer, or whether it is simply trying to find the answers that have not been found until today. If you look back at the last decade of public engagement from 2013, and ESRC and ADRN's work around de-identified data across multiple devolved nations and multiple workshops, there are clear red lines about questions about big data sets being joined up, about commercial reuse of data, and particularly around locational data. You can go to the 2013 work done through Ipsos Mori and Wellcome. You can look at all the workshops that were done in care data in 2014 and 15. You can look at the one-way mirror public engagement that was done. You can come forwards to 2018. We carried out a poll with parents asking them about educational data, and over 80% said they wanted to be asked before their children's pupil data was passed over, especially around really sensitive areas like special educational needs, to third parties. And you could look at the ICO's work last year, the 2020 survey, that again found public opinion is actually going in the other direction around data sharing. It's becoming more concerned about how data is distributed and who is using it. There's consistency of opinion, and I get consistently frustrated by the calls for more public engagement, when actually I think we need to take a really thorough stock check of existing feedback, see the consistencies, and decide how we are going to effect those in action. So to sum up, we're going to rehumanize the political narrative in people's data. How are we going to do it? Change is not easy, but change is necessary. If you look at the research from Professor Sonia Livingston, Maria Stoilova, and Richard Nadagri, carried out partly through funding from the ICO over the last couple of years, children understand how data is used about them to a certain degree, and they certainly understand what it means to have agency and autonomy over their own lives, and how privacy contributes to that. They want change. But will the new consultation give them the change that they want to see? Questions are around sort of trade, adequacy assessments and mechanisms. Questions around data subjects, the assessment of the impact assessment says will not materially affect individual rights. This quote comes from Cathy O'Neill in 2017, talking about artificial intelligence. A model's blind spots reflects the judgments and priorities of its creators. I would point out that this same statement could be applied to the policy direction of travel we have at the moment. Whatever judgments and priorities are being built into the national data strategy and the new governance models has blind spots. And I think the blind spots are particularly around how we reflect not what is going to change, but looking at what should change, what's not working right now for people's rights. If you've got young people and children saying they don't really support, they can't be part of this kind of data community, data society, information society that we're driving them towards, it is not sustainable. And I would urge policymakers to rethink how we look at involving children in data, in the data about them, and building the infrastructure that they need to understand it. It's not only about skills and training. It's not about digital literacy. It's about bringing the data to them that's about them and giving them the understanding of who knows what about me? How can I control it? When can I see it? Can I make corrections? Can I get redress if there's something wrong? None of those things are enhanced in the current strategy direction. Blind spots also don't look at beyond often your own small bubble. And it was interesting to think a little bit about the language and the language of metaphors when we're thinking about artificial intelligence as well. When we're not looking at English, butter, for example, in German has a gender. We often we think about fairness. There's a lot in the new direction about fairness. I think it ties itself in all sorts of knots in fairness, because actually what fairness really means in data protection terms is, have I told you what is going to be done with your data? And can I show you that what was said was going to be done was what was actually done? So in the same way that children's social care recommendations at the moment around machine learning is that now is a good time to stop and think, I think it's a good time to stop and think about a direction of travel for children and their data in public administrative data sets. As Michael Sanders said of the What Works Centre for Children's Social Care, after the pandemic, everything's changed and our data is scrambled to the point of uselessness in any case. Time to stop and think, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jen. That's brilliant. So we're now open to questions. So as a reminder, please put your questions in the chat and we'll call you up to ask Jen. Or if you'd rather I read out your questions, please do say so. But to kick things off, I'll ask my own question. So Jen, from your talk, I think one of the brilliant things that came across is how insightful and engaged the young people you talk to are about data and the language around it. I guess my question is, how much are young people already thinking about data, or rather how proactively engaged are they with understanding data about them and how it's used?
Good question. I think there's two ways to look at that. One is from the academic research perspective. You can look at data research going back several years, including, for example, the work of Dana Boyd in the US, who's done a lot of work and engagement around teens and how they feel about kind of interactions with privacy and who knows what about them. You can look back at the 2010 work that was done by the Royal Academy of Engineering that was about pharmaceutical and health and data that children had kind of were asked about in workshops. So there's plenty of academic research out there, and the most recent, as I pointed out, is often by Professor Livingston and her team at LSE. And also Professor Lundy in Belfast. But there's, I think, just a much more basic way of looking at it as well, which is that it tends to be us in this policy sphere that talk about data as a thing, and that literally we keep talking about it as a thing, whereas children don't tend ever to think about it as a thing. I mean, in the workshop, they mentioned when you say, data, the first thing they think of is how much money have I got left on my phone? It's much more when asked to think about data as metaphors, they'll recall how else it is used. And most commonly, they came up with great metaphors that they just in speaking about it, things like, having an informational breakdown and, how do we kind of apply ourselves as machines and thinking about our mental health and our well-being. But I think in terms of day-to-day, we in the policy sphere put too much emphasis, and this is actually one of the problems, on it being part of something else that is an other. It's a thing that we can consider separate and divisible from people's lives, when in fact this is everyday life. Everything is information, And so much of the sort of nuances of academic debate around what is personal data, what is not personal data. One of the questions in the data and new direction consultation is, where will the boundaries be in anonymization? These are silly questions, because data is fluid, data changes, data has different characteristics at different points in time. The one piece of data about you may be personal to you one day because it's being used in a context where you can be identified. It may be one of thousands of people with the same name in a different context that may not be considered personal data when held by somebody else at the same time. The concepts, I think, sometimes around how we are thinking about data and how young people and children think about data are different. We need to much better understand how children perceive themselves and their development, and their developing personalities, their developing relationships between themselves and institutions, between themselves and authority, and how that information is shaping their lives. And I think that's where we could learn a lot more actually about how young people think about data in terms of how it affects them. What impact it has day to day is much more important than thinking about it as a product.
That's brilliant, thank you. And I guess one other question I had was, obviously the framing for the talk was data is not an avocado. Why do you think we do fall back on these metaphors so often, and are there any benefits in using them?
From the earliest of times, people have used images, things that they're familiar with, to simplify complex ideas. If you even go back to Cicero, some of his rhetoric is around images and trying to dehumanize people in the judicial system, talking about how you can make people seem less in order to be able to do things to them that you wouldn't otherwise do to people. And so data metaphors are nothing new. They're certainly widely used. But I think what's interesting to think is which metaphors last, which have longevity, and where have they come from? It's not something we've researched, but I think would be an interesting project, is why have these data metaphors stuck and not the others, like data is nuclear waste, or data is toxic, that authors in the US may have used in books or media, but hasn't stuck, and why have others become the predominant metaphors?
Great. We've got a question from Charles. I don't know if you want to share it yourself, Charles. Or I can read it out. It's only a short one. Charles asked if you could share the link to your report that you've referenced.
Of course, I'd be delighted to. I'll just stick it in the chat at the end of the meeting, if I may, and I think it's probably already been tweeted in our Twitter stream as well.
Brilliant.
Thanks for asking.
And we have a question from Robert. Did you want to ask Jen your question?
Hi, I don't know if you can hear me. I'm having a few communication difficulties, so it actually might be easier if you just read it out. Sorry, thanks.
No worries, we can hear you, but I'll read it.
Okay.
Robert says, hi Jen, thanks for a very interesting talk. My question is not directed at children's data, but more generally, and draws on my own research regarding data subject complicity in data harvesting practices, which I've aligned using metaphor to religious rituals that encourage giving. To what extent has your work shown that personal data is not passively extracted by something given, the etymology of data? Do you have examples?
There's a lot to unpack in that question. I think the idea around religious rituals is fascinating, that encourage giving. I mean, there's all sorts of questions about power in there, power of an institution, power of the community, peer pressure. I haven't I'm just looking at the question in more detail again. What work shows that personal data is not passively extracted? I mean, I think that one of the failings of data metaphors, if this is helpful to the question, is that it doesn't talk very well about data that is passively extracted. There's nothing that talks about data well from, you walk past 1,000 sensors between here and your train station in the city, and there's CCTV, and there are sensors built into the street furniture around you, and there's perhaps interactive advertising, and none of these metaphors work well for data in that context. So I'm not sure I can answer your question, Robert, very well. I'll look forward to reading your research when it comes out, but I think data harvesting practices is still all about power, and I think it's that sort of imbalance of power that we're trying to rectify here.
Great, thank you. While we wait for any more questions in the chat, I'll ask another one of my own. So with all this research that you've talked about in mind, this might be quite a broad question, but what would be your kind of utopia for the language we use around data and engaging children and young people?
I think one of the later articles I read when doing this research that stood out for me is actually the one that we pulled out for this talk, which was Data is Not an Avocado. And it was written, I'm just trying to remember the author's name. I'm sorry, I've forgotten. But it pulled out basically the idea that we have gone so far with analogies that they don't work very well, and perhaps we should stop using analogies at all. And I think the utopia is always going to be a moving place. I don't think there probably is such a thing as a utopia, but I think there's certainly a sweet spot, shall we say. And I don't think that that the ideas around personal data, and part of that being part of public administrative data sets, is incompatible with productive use of data within an economy. It is part of that bigger ecosystem, and it's also important for its place in research. What I think is underplayed is we have the support structures to enable research, and increasingly the value is being seen in safe settings and the sort of the tree settings where you can access data without having to take data away, and increase its security, and increase that sort of 5 safes around safe people, safe data, safe research. But we're not talking about the infrastructure of how we enable that trust and trustworthiness to be passed on from the infrastructure in the system to the people in the system. So if I want to know that my data is going to be used safely in research, how do I know? Who's going to tell me? Where is it stored? Where's that information stored about what data you hold on me? And I still think, after 10 years of giving away national pupil data at the Department for Education, it's shocking that I cannot get a full, complete record of my own children's data. I can't go to them and say, if you're aged under 37 today and at any time state educated, you should be able to ask the Department for Education, can I have a copy of my personal data that you've been storing, and who have you given it to? So that is my building block towards a better future. I'm not sure it's a utopia, but those building blocks are absolutely vital. And I don't think it matters which landscape you prefer, because let's face it, there's some political choices here. You may disagree that green energies are the better way to deliver energy for the future world. You may support the idea of data ownership as a product. Whatever landscape, however, you support, it doesn't have to be binary. These can be multi-layered, but whatever role data plays in that, the person is indivisible from their data. This is personal data about people, and we can't separate the two. And at the moment, the person, without being in the picture of how we look at the landscape, means that they're not building the infrastructure that we need as people to be able to say, show me the registers of where you've stored data. Show me the algorithms register that's being used to make decisions about me in universal credit or in health or in welfare or in national level. Show me how decisions about me are then filtered down at local level, and those sort of registers of what processes happen, what infrastructure we have, decision making, and all of that is the sort of infrastructure that's missing to join the system, the glue in the system, if you like, between the people and the institutions that want data to be able to flow between them.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll just give a couple more moments in case anyone wants to get in any last questions. I'll just check the chat to make sure I haven't missed any. We've got one from Gangesh. Would you like to read out your question?
Hi, my name is Gangesh. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, thank you.
Right. So I was just wondering, in the context of community data and data exchanges, there's been a lot of language around stewardship and trusteeship of data. Have you seen any effective analogies or ineffective ones? What are your views on that kind of a relationship being described, especially in the context of young people and children?
It's a really interesting, timely question, because, as you say, the idea of sort of stewardship and trust is very popular in some quarters. I think we, in our research, focused on looking for the analogies around data is. So I wouldn't say that I could answer that in terms of there is or there isn't analogies out there, because we didn't look for them. We were looking around the nature of the data rather than the nature of relationships about the data. But it might be a really interesting second project. I think the question is, even how you describe those relationships can then affect how people feel about them. In some ways, I think this is the crux of the kind of data metaphor idea, is looking back, and we include this in our report, that the idea that for example, how crime can be represented is a one that was already tested in other people's research, and they sort of tested the idea that crime described as a virus had a sort of more social, community, public health approach response in the people that talked about it, whereas crime described as a wild beast had a more policing, authoritative, negative reaction to it. And so how we describe these things affects the behavior and the decisions that we shape the response to that about. So I haven't seen particular analogies around relationships to trustees or stewards. I haven't looked for them. I think there probably are interesting parallels to draw out in Indigenous research around sort of Aboriginal relationships to land and questions around that kind of stewardship idea, but I haven't looked at it.
Brilliant. We've got another question from Robert, who says, I'm a little skeptical of the level of individual control of personal data that is often mooted. What does that infrastructure look like? Do people want that control?
Great question. I think one of the examples that keeps getting battered about right now, and everybody groans when they hear it, is everybody's got consent fatigue. Everybody's fed up with having to click cookies away or accept them or reject them. And this is sort of used, I think, as a to some extent a stalking horse. I'll bring in another terrible metaphor here. It's the idea that if you're tired of consent around one thing, that you might be tired around consent about another thing, which I think is a really slippery slope to be going down. It often reflects in current decisions actually a quite limited understanding of the current landscape around the ad tech environment. These click pop-ups are not there to be clicked away to be a nuisance, but actually they are an indicator of how the data broker landscape has been allowed to get away with ad tech tracking and following our every click and our every move. And sometimes you look at these, if you go into them in depth, there's hundreds of third parties. I don't give my permission to want to share everywhere I go and everything I do with all these hundreds of third parties. So I think the question of, what does that infrastructure look like? Because do people want that level of control? Is two parts. One is, why do we not have that control today? And therefore, whose responsibility is it to fix? And I think around the cookies mechanism, the responsibility is that the ad tech industry needs regulated, it needs fixed. The arguments have been made, civil society has made them, there have been legal cases, the regulator in the UK and elsewhere has failed to act. And if we just regulated that in law as it is already meant to be, rather than looking at new ways of doing it, we would find that consent fatigue went away. So I think people do want control. Certainly the research done with young people in all of those pieces of public engagement we mentioned earlier, and the work of Sonia Livingston, for example, most recently, children do want control. And our workshop showed people want to understand, what effect are you going to have on my life? Why are you going to affect my life? I think for children, it's particularly important because it might affect you for the whole of your life. And so I think that infrastructure has to be manageable. It certainly has to be, something that isn't seen as an additional burden, but actually is at different levels. You have to have, the administrative national data sets need an infrastructure which is about transparency, about openness, about registers and tracking, and just which may be open and understandable to a certain set of people in the sector, for example, civil society and others. Then there's going to be things that go down to local authority level, interactions between you and your school, or your school and the local authority should be understandable, and they should be understandable as a relationship. Who do I have the relationship with? And who is, the data controller gets quite abstract, but if we bring it back to who do I interact with, who has my data because I interacted with them, then they've got a responsibility to me as a steward of my data to be able to tell me what they've done with it. And I think, that infrastructure is quite simple when it comes to some things like health or education. It could be reports on demand. It can be as often or as little as you want. It can show you what data is being collected, where has it gone, here's how to correct it. Now, these are basics. They should already exist. They just don't. And I think some of that infrastructure is quite straightforward. There are examples where it does work. But I think, at national level, they simply haven't had the political will to make it happen yet.
Brilliant. I'll wait a couple more moments in case there's any last questions. We probably have time for one more. Okay, then I think we shall wrap up there then.
Okay.
So
I was just going to think, one thing I forgot to say, I think, one of the big questions around the data consultation is please take part. I'll put the link onto our Twitter feed as well. Is I think we need greater sort of thinking around this from everyday people who are talking about, do people want this? Do they want this level of control? And I think one of the things we should think about is, a lot of the data strategy and things is talking about reducing risk. It's about, reducing data protection impact assessments, having no data protection officer, reducing prior consultation, not tracking exactly what data processing is going under what's called ROPA, Article 30 of the GDPR. But all these things don't take away risk. The risk doesn't disappear from data processing as a result of not having the processes around it. The risk is just transferred. The risk's not reduced, it's just redistributed. And I think that we're looking at a situation where, you know, government's quite keen on reducing bureaucracy for industry and for economic partners, but we must look at it as it doesn't reduce risk. It simply redistributes it, and it redistributes it back to us as individuals. So I'd like us as individuals and collectively to get involved. And if you want to follow up with me on that afterwards, I'm very happy to.
And on that note, we do have a question for your Twitter handle as well. So do you want to share that before we wrap up?
Of course, thank you.
Great. So I just want to give a big thank you to Jen for the really interesting talk, and for all of you that contributed questions. They were great. Please do join us again next week for our next lunchtime lecture, where we'll have Hayden Sutherland discussing what the future holds for the UK's transport system and why embracing open data initiatives is just the first step in moving to a smart transport ecosystem. But until then, have a lovely weekend and thank you for joining us. Thanks.
Thank you very much.